Forget the Chaos Deities and the Emperor of Mankind. This guy's the one man in Warhammer 40k who you really don't want to tick off. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Guard once more, and I thought we'd focus on Sly Marbo today, review his rules in the new Guard Codex, and how much value he can bring to Imperial Guard lists. We'll take a look over his datasheet, how much damage he's likely to cause, and how I think about using him in-game. Sly Marbo is of course a master of guerrilla warfare, and a fairly unsubtle Rambo reference from Games Workshop. His last name's a direct anagram of Rambo, and his first name is an allusion to the actor who played him, and his character perhaps isn't too enormously different in Warhammer 40k, a great big muscled Kazachan guy, a master of guerrilla warfare who's very happy taking you out either with a machine gun or a knife. As guard models go, he is one of the more recent ones, a character model that costs around £17, €22 or $29 from Games Workshop. Not awesome in terms of price per dollar, seeing as he's a fairly cheap model in game, but there are certainly worse examples out there in Warhammer 40k. The current model features a huge pistol, envenomed blades, and Kazachan Flora and an unlucky orc on his base. Initially he just had rules in the box, but now he's been folded into the main Guard Codex, getting his own proper datasheet in there when several of the other Guard heroes went AWOL. If you're looking at picking him up, Element Games does sell him in the UK. Unfortunately, he's one of the models that doesn't have the discounts, as he's basically a direct Games Workshop web store model only, so they don't get the discount to the third-party retailers. If you were thinking about picking him up or any other Guard miniatures, buying through Element would cost the same amount though, and it does help support the channel if you're interested in doing that. I'll leave a link down in the video description. Let's talk rules though, and Sly Marbo is an elite's choice for the new Astra Militarum Codex, 50 points as a single unique character, and he is rather unique within the army. Marbo basically has the profile and weapons of a mini assassin, and fills a pretty similar role, arguably doing better than some of them against certain targets. He moves 6 inches, hits on 2s, is strength 4 and toughness 3, 5 wounds and 5 attacks, leadership 7 and a 5+ save. Overall fairly capable of dishing out a fair amount of hurt, but he is very fragile if the enemy decides to shoot him back. Keywords wise, he is regimental, so he gets your regimental doctrines and things, and then the other interesting ones are Platoon and Melter Mine. Melter Mine helps out a couple of stratagems, and Platoon interestingly allows him to get orders if it makes sense, though I think typically he's more likely going to be acting alone. Weapons-wise, is equipped with the Ripper Pistol and the Envenomed Blade. Both of them are mid-strength, mid-AP, and usually 2 damage, so quite good at taking out things like Space Marines. The Ripper Pistol is a 12-inch range weapon with 3 shots, strength 5, AP-2, and damage 2, and interestingly you can ignore Lookout Sir and do mortal wounds on 6s with it. If you roll well, it's certainly plausible that he could take out something like a 4 wounds cheap support character if your opponent gets a bit unlucky with their saves. The Envenomed Blade gives you +2 strength, so usually strength 6, AP-2, and damage 1, though you get damage 2 against anything besides vehicles, and usually he'd be wanting to go up against infantry anyway. We'll look at some damage output for those in just a second. Otherwise, being a mini Rambo commando style model, he does have a few special rules. He can't be a warlord, so no traits or anything. His most interesting rules though are that he can deep strike, so you can set him up in reserve and appear anywhere that's greater than 9 inches from enemies, and when he comes out of reserve like this, he can reroll charge rolls when he does. Usually with a reroll, it's going to be around about a 50% chance of making a charge at 9 inches. Certainly not enormously reliable, but a better chance than he would have otherwise. Finally, and perhaps most interesting, he does have a very nice special rule that basically allows him to at least guarantee 2 strikes most of the time. As at the end of the fight phase, once per game he can opt to return to reserves, and he can trigger that rule whether or not he's actually fought in combat or not. He doesn't actually have to have charged something and been successful to do this. I feel like that's really quite a cool rule. It basically means that you could have one essentially entirely free round of shooting with that Ripper pistol, just drop him down, fire it, and go back into reserve. Unless the opponent's got intercept or anything, they can't do anything about it. Then I guess he can aim to turn up for the real show on turn 3. Overall, he's basically a fun little mini assassin type unit for 50 points, and for that cost he does a reasonable amount of damage to light and medium infantry. Speaking of which, here are just the very rough turn-on-turn damage outputs that you could usually expect from the Ripper pistol and his melee damage. The pistol is usually going to average around about 2 dead guardsmen, 1 dead space marine, and then struggles a bit more against heavier targets. Still though, considering he only costs 50 points himself, in theory by the time you've killed 2 20-point space marines, he's done the vast majority of his work, never mind if he actually gets into melee. Then, presuming you are deep striking him, the charge roll would have a 48% chance of success with that full reroll that he gets, and then presuming you try and charge the first time and then escape to a charge again a second time, it would mean that you'd usually expect one of the 2 charges to succeed, or a 72% chance of at least one of them going off. Still not super reliable though. His charge damage is definitely a little bit better against infantry, 3 or 4 dead guardsmen this time, and 1 or 2 dead space marines, and a little bit more against the heavier infantry, and a bit worse against vehicles as their damage 1. In general, when you're buying him into a list, I think it means that you could usually roughly expect 2 rounds of fire with the Ripper pistol and 1 charge. So in theory, against an army where it's got some reasonable prey to be fighting against, things like Space Marines, he should have a pretty strong chance of killing more than his points are worth, even if he can't get his hands on something like a support character, or a target that's maybe a little bit more fragile and high points cost. Certainly if the enemy positions badly, and say leaves something like a Skitarian Marshal or an Eldar Warlock too close to the front line, there's a pretty reasonable chance that Marbo might be able to kill them with the Ripper pistol, and certainly really quite a good chance if he manages to get a charge off. In terms of synergy for the rest of the codex, I think Marbo is about one of the most independent operators out of any of them. Kind of true to the lore, he generally wants to be off on the other side of the board doing his own thing. In general, orders aren't going to be likely to work on him too well if he's deep striking. You just wouldn't get the opportunity to order them unless he winds up close to your officers later in the game. Though I guess in theory maybe the most useful ones could either be fixed bayonets for AP-3 on that big knife, or potentially objectives secured, I suppose. For regimental doctrines, I feel like you're not really going to want to tailor them around Marbo. It's just going to be lumped with whatever the main regiment doctrine that you've chosen for the rest of the army is. Born Soldier is kind of fine with the Ripper pistol, certainly gives it a fair bit more bias against heavy targets, as you're likely to be triggering mortal wounds with the auto wounds of 6. Otherwise though, if you happen to be using them, then any of these look okay for him. Heirloom weapons for extra range, Swift as the Wind in particular for a better chance of charging out of deep strike. Elite Sharpshooters is kind of fine to re-roll a hit roll if he gets a 1. Veteran Guerrillas can allow him to ignore some cover, and Brutal Strength could give him a very scary strength of 7, potentially bullying infantry or small monsters all the way up to toughness 6 in combat, wounding them on 3s. Stratagems wise, if you did have a chance to snipe a key support character, then perhaps re-rolling a wound roll on the Ripper pistol might not actually be the worst value in the world. I think that's kind of situational though. Otherwise, the 2 relevant ones for his keywords are Vicious Traps and the Melter Mine. If he does wind up in cover and gets charged, he's actually got a 3+ chance to deal 2d3 mortal wounds on the enemy when they charge him, and on a 1 or 2 he still gets 1d3. Certainly could be very intimidating to some units, particularly if they're a bit depleted. Otherwise, the Melter Mine could be an option for getting him a little bit more damage against vehicles, 1 CP for usually around 3 mortal wounds to them. It is going to be better than his Envenomed Blade, but basically adding around about 2 wounds extra damage output. I think the biggest deal is whether or not it actually is enough to kill the vehicle, and if not, you're probably better off saving CP for elsewhere. In game, I feel that Marbo is really quite usable at 50 points. I certainly don't think he's so essential that he needs to be used in every single guard list. He operates a bit independently, and if there's more essential things, he's probably going to get cut. But he does feel that, certainly against certain opponents, he's going to be a real problem. Generally using him in game, I'd want to deep strike him, as he can pose a fairly serious threat to certain infantry units, and even if he didn't have any other deep strike threats, it might force your opponent to just reposition their entire army to try and zone him out. When he's only 50 points worth of threat, messing with the enemy positioning to that extent unless they want their characters sniped could actually be significantly useful. I guess in theory you could start him on the board as a countercharge type threat if a whole load of light models are coming to you that he's actually good against, but I feel in general that's less likely to be useful. Arriving him from reserve, he'd be turning up on turn 2. I think ideally you would want to drop him on turn 2 if possible to get some damage and impact the game as soon as he can. I guess you just have to assess the enemy army and look at the targets of opportunity. I feel like cheap support characters with something like 4 wounds, things like Eldar Warlocks or Skitarian Marshals and things, would be his absolute ideal prey. But failing that, any 1 or 2 wound infantry of significant high value would be quite nice, or potentially just bullying some light infantry off a backfield objective perhaps, if over the course of a couple of turns of carnage, Marbo can kill an entire light infantry squad and force something to return from the front to have to go back and take that objective again, then he might well have caused enough disruption to make himself worth it. I think when you drop him, the challenge is to try and have something that's worth killing like that with the Ripper pistol, and then also have a charge lined up on something that if he does make it, he'll be able to do some damage to them, and he won't just get killed in return, as he really wants to return to reserve for that next burst of Ripper fire. It means that you probably don't want to just set him up and then just go charging him off somewhere into a whole load of Terminators or something, which might just punch him dead and gain a little bit more movement into the bargain. Then, at the end of all that, if he's in any danger whatsoever, he almost certainly wants to go back into reserve and then rinse and repeat on turn 3. This time, though, maybe thinking a little bit harder about where he's going to wind up. If he does fail the charge, he might want to be a bit more protected, or ideally in cover to use that good vicious trap stratagem if you have CP left. And also if he is remaining on the board, then he might need to bear in mind inflexible command when positioning him as well. Sometimes it could be relevant, sometimes by that point you might have amassed so many points that it looks like you're going to near enough max it whatever you do. Otherwise, I think there's a fair bit of value in just a cheap and disruptive infantry charge out of nowhere. You could potentially tie up a powerful enemy shooting unit for a turn. Say if he charged some powerful tank busters or something, and he didn't manage to kill them but survive, he might actually want to stay on the board so they can't shoot next turn. Otherwise, he could be a tool to put the finishing blow on a vehicle with that melter mine. If something's got 2 or 3 wounds left, then it's a pretty credible target for him, and he might be just the man for the job if nothing else can get line of sight on it. Overall, for the points, I think is really quite reasonable for what he does, and not a terrible include in Astra Militarum lists. I do feel like maybe one of his biggest weaknesses with the secondary objectives from Nephilim might be that inflexible command one, a secondary objective that most guard lists tend to want to play, and if he's on the board then it's going to put a bit of a spanner in the works unless he's cooched right up to an officer. It might be a bit more of an on-paper problem though. Realistically, he might just be dropping on turn 3, and then the enemy winds up killing him, removing that problem whatsoever, and you've got a pretty reasonable chance of him maxing inflexible command, even if you might miss a single turn of scoring the infantry bit. Let me know your thoughts on the one-man army though. How has Mr. Marbo been performing for you in-game with the new Guard Codex, and how tempted are you to run him in more competitive armies? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I will certainly have a fair bit more for the Imperial Guard. I'll leave a link to my Sentinels video down in the video description if you'd like to check out another unit review. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention as well that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that linked in the video description as well. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits every month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.